How do you go from admiring Sargent's effortless brushwork to actually being able to paint that way yourself? If you've been trying to paint like Sargent and it's just not translating to your canvas the way you'd hoped, you might be missing the most important part: how you analyze and understand the painting before you even begin. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to dissect a master painting, reverse engineer a process like Sargent's, and go into your own pieces with clarity and confidence. Before we dive in, I want to give you a little bit of backstory though. So when I first started sharing my art on YouTube, my goal was to make a living from my art, but I had no one helping me out. I didn't have the benefit of an art school or a mentor who explained how to reach my goal, so I had to figure this out on my own. And as a result, you've gotten to see the full journey. From setting my goal to going full-time, taking that leap, quitting my day job, and most recently being honored with the gold medal at the Oil Painters of America Eastern Regional. It's been a really surreal, exciting journey, but I had to have a clear system in place to continue to learn, grow, and improve my work, and that's what I'm sharing today. It's going to be a key piece to that puzzle. But if you're hungry for more or you're serious about reaching your own oil painting goals, I'm going to be hosting a live masterclass where I'm going to walk you through my full start to finish strategy that helped me to go all the way from just loving oil painting to being able to make exactly the kinds of paintings that I dreamt of, and having that unlock all sorts of things, from being able to do this full time to being honored with incredible recognition like the OPA Gold Medal. Details to that live masterclass are in the description, and I can't wait to see you there. Now let's dive in. All right, I want to go ahead and walk through my plan to make my art like Sargent's, or make it more like Sargent's, in the next 12 months. This is part of my plan to have more original pieces available for things like Oil Painters of America competitions or Portrait Society of America competitions. Specifically, I have a goal to enter the International this year. This is something that I have repeatedly put off for no good reason, other than simply being focused on teaching and not having pieces that that I was excited to enter. So what I want to do to address that is to actually just really focus on producing art that I would be excited by and really proud of. I think this is something that comes up quite a lot for my students. Specifically, what comes up for them is they say, okay, I want to get more commissions, I want to enter Portrait Society, I want to have OPA after my name, there's a specific exhibition that I want my work to get juried into. And oftentimes painters can really set that goal and then feel overwhelmed and stuck. And when people have maybe more of a business-oriented goal, like I want to book more commissions, or I want to sell more of my art, make more money from my art, take my art full-time, I think they get really caught up on the idea of business and marketing, which is an important skill, but oftentimes they're putting the cart before the horse because the business and the marketing feels more foreign and more prohibitive. And so they don't necessarily just put in the repetitions that they need to make their art get to a place that they would be really excited to market. Or to put it really simply, if you're not proud enough of your work so that it becomes easy to market, you're gonna have a hard time. And so this goes hand in hand with what I'm doing here. In order to enter these competitions, I need to put aside time, but I also need to get into a flow with my own painting where I have a process that really gets me to that end result. And if you've been following me for a while, since I started on YouTube back before 2020, you'll know that I wasn't always where I am now, both in terms of things like going full time with my art, but also just in terms of the quality of the work itself. I'm really proud that I have had quite an evolution that you all have been able to witness here on YouTube. And so what I'm sharing with my plan for the next year is something that I have already tested and proven with my work from the past several years.
This is simply taking what I've already accomplished and then building on it to a very specific goal. So if you've been following my channel for a while, you will know that one really important step in this process is having a really clear vision of what that goal looks like. But needless to say, I know that this style that I see Sargent painting in and some of Sargent's contemporaries painting in is the direction that I want to take my work. So that's what I'm taking a look at here today. So on the left, I have a piece by John Singer Sargent, and on the right, I have a piece by Jamie Koreth. There's a reason that I'm looking at these two pieces together. Specifically, what I really love in Jamie's work is that he clearly has that Sargent influence, but I have the benefit, because he is a living painter working today, I can actually see more of his process than I can of Sargent's work. I can follow his Instagram and see more pieces that are meant to just be studies, or I can see the block-in phases from pieces that got finished at a later date. And that's exactly what we're looking at here. We're looking at the block-in stage of a portrait that he's painted that I saved specifically because when I looked at it, I thought to myself, this just has such a Sargent feeling, but it has a little bit more of the block-in feel that I'm going for. And so I'm using these two pieces in concert with one another. I want them to be complementary. I'm going to be completing a master copy of this Sargent piece, and I'm also going to take inspiration and clues from this Jamie Koreth painting. So what I want to do right now is simply to walk you through my analysis, my plan for this piece, because I think that it's going to be really eye-opening for you all to be able to see how I think. I also think that when you follow along with my master copy, this video is going to give you some really helpful context to that. So let's go ahead and dive in. Right away, I want to point out that I was very intentional in choosing these two pieces to relate to one another. So I didn't choose one of Sargent's portraits of children or younger women, because that's pretty far removed from this Jamie Koreth piece that I knew was going to be part of the inspiration. So the nice thing about looking at these two together is that they clearly have a lot of similarities. They are both men, they are both portraits that are relatively straight on, and while the light is coming from different directions in both, I have a very similar light and shadow pattern across the face. We have this little triangle of Rembrandt lighting in the Sargent, and while the shape isn't identical in the Jamie Koreth piece, it is very similar. I also get very similar treatment of this shadow falling off the side of the nose. And not only that, but when I look at like how Jamie has handled the brow, it actually really reminds me of a lot of Sargent pieces. Here quickly, some of the other contenders that I was looking at that kind of show that same style of mark making. I especially like this close-up for the brow, but I see a similar handling of details around the eye and how the brushstrokes from the Sargent piece I just really see very clearly echoed in Jamie's painting. Same thing here, we have kind of this like fuzzy indication of a brow, followed by like one definitive stroke, which is what I'm seeing here in Jamie's piece. I also really like how both painters have these very distinctive shapes that they're not shying away from. You know, they're not going back and softening. I love how this shadow shape of the eye going into the brow, Sargent's really unapologetic about it in the same way that Jamie is. He's not going back and like adding detail and softening edges. He's just letting it exist as a hard shape, and I think that's part of what makes this so masterful. And really quickly, one other thing I want to call attention to between the two of these is this very decisive upper lash line. The shape differs between Sargent's and Jamie's, but the colors are very, very close to one another. And this entire line of lashes is really just evoked with a single swipe of the brush. And not only that, but it's interesting in this piece, we have a little bit more information in the eye. So we have this little tiny speck of a highlight. We can clearly see the pupil. We can see this little bit of light beading up on the inner corner of the eye where maybe there's just like a little bit of moisture in the eye. Whereas this eye is much more evocative of Jamie's block-in, where we have this very light overall iris color. We don't really see much in the way of the pupil. You could argue, especially if we zoom in, actually it almost is much harder to see when zooming in. It does get a little bit darker under the eyelid where that shadow is being cast. And you can argue that there's a little bit of pupil being evoked, but it is certainly similar to what Jamie has done here. And that's why I really like seeing these pieces side by side. This painting gives me a lot of clues as to what needs to happen in the Sargent piece at the block-in stage. And this is a really common question I get. How do I know the order in which things went down if you're only going off of a finished piece? And it's a really good question. And trust me, when there is a recipe for this, I will put it together and I will be sharing it. In the meantime, I know a lot of it is coming from my own experience. But the great thing is that any places where there might be gaps in my instinct or intuition, I think Jamie's painting is really helping to fill in here for me. So for instance, one thing I noticed really quickly is there seems to be something pretty similar happening with both of these brows, where there is a lighter brow color that seems to be underneath this darker brow accent that comes in like the inner half or inner third of the brow, depending on the portrait. And the reason why I can tell the order in which these have gone down is that one seems to be interrupting the other. So specifically, I don't see any evidence that this lighter color was brought right up to the edge of this darker color. In fact, there's a pretty distinctive hard edge all along the dark color and no places where that edge has been modified or changed. Whereas this one, I do see a lot of edge variety around this. It's very soft in all of these places, and then it gets very hard right here, suggesting that probably this darker mark came a little bit later. And so when I go in to paint the brows, I'm probably going to take a similar approach to what Jamie did here, where I'm essentially seeing the same thing. There is this brown and this gray that are blending together as like a base shape, and then this one mark of the inner half of the brow going over top of it. Similarly, this mark of the lash line clearly came later because the edge around the entire mark is very uniform. So it stands to reason that this shape in the beginning probably consisted just of this gray mass with this lighter brown mass. Maybe eventually it had this kind of softened blue for the iris, but there was a point at which this upper lash line and the darker accent of the brow were missing. I'm going to attempt to take the same approach in studying the Sargent. I think the way Jamie also handles something like the mustache here is really telling. It sort of is similar in that it appears that there's this overall flat shape of the mustache that then gets worked into with darker accents. So again, we kind of see this uniform shape around most of the brown of the mustache. And then we see this one like real change in edges right with this dark mark and then this one. And we can kind of imagine how if this dark mark of the philtrum happened to be removed, this brown could probably just blend right into this one. And this brown probably extended all the way through, but then was covered up by this darkened set of brush strokes representing the fact that this half of the mustache is in shadow. And it appears that there's something kind of similar happening in Sargent's piece, where if we look at the sideburn down to like the jowl of the beard, it appears to be very flatly scumbled in with this kind of generic greenish gray. And then we slowly start to see marks that look like they were worked into it, and then darker marks that came as an accent later. I think this is a little bit more intuitive to see right here in the mustache versus looking into the bottom of the beard where there's just more happening. And so when I go to paint this section, I'm going to do my best to be really intentional about blocking in with this overall grayish mass, slowly starting to build in softer variations in color and value that are close to the initial value and color. And then I'm going to leave those darker accents that are farther away from the color and value that we started with till the very end. Same thing with some of these light highlights that maybe work back in here in the bottom. One difference that I am seeing between these two is the color of this nostril that is in the light. My suspicion is that if this were taken all the way to a finish, this actually might get darkened up. But one thing I do notice when I compare the two side by side is that the ruddy brown or orange, kind of depending on how you think about it, this nostril in Jamie's piece, I see a little hint of it sitting underneath the darker area of the nostril here in Sargent's. So it might make sense for me to actually start by indicating these in a very light way, and then just kind of sneaking up on the darkness over time. So this is going to be kind of my marching orders as I dive into this piece. I'm really going to be thinking about how can I start with something that has an overall pretty compressed value structure where I really leave the darks in my back pocket and probably really leave some of the harder edges in my back pocket and really just reserve them for the end of the painting. I'm going to call out two other things that are standing out to me at this stage. And then I think I'm going to actually dive into painting this. So the first one is the hairline. I absolutely love what Jamie has done right here. It is so soft. It really beautifully evokes that transition into the hairline here without getting into or succumbing to the temptation to have these tiny raking strokes representing individual hairs. And this is very reminiscent of what we see in a lot of Sargent paintings. And this one is no exception. I actually a little bit prefer what Jamie has done here, but these are really, really similar. So I'm going to be extra mindful in like this passage of the hairline to make sure I capture that. And any of these harder edges in the hair, I'm just going to go ahead and hold off on those till the end. One thing I do notice looking at the hair in particular though, I can see this kind of where the, I guess like the temple area meets the rest of the hair, but on some of these lighter accents in the hair as well. These are marks that appear to have come later, at least in the case of these highlights in the hair. But as we know from the earlier part of the conversation, this area of like sideburn, it probably came pretty early in the piece. And yet there's this very like dry brush quality to a lot of what we're seeing in the hair overall, which suggests that the paint isn't super wet at the point at which these marks are being made. So it could be that these marks were made after the painting was given a little bit of an opportunity to start setting up. And I'll be honest, this is one of the only places where matching the brush strokes might pose a little bit of a challenge. Everything else, I know from my own experience, I'm pretty sure I can get very comfortably working wet into wet. And that just comes from me looking at each passage and asking myself, could I replicate, for instance, like just this little section of brushwork? Could I do the same thing with this little section of brushwork? And throughout the painting, the answer to that is yes. And when it comes to these more scumbly dry brush sort of marks, the answer is I have gotten it before, but I can tell this is coming later in the painting and I'm more comfortable getting these marks early in the painting. So this might pose a little bit of a problem. And if I were working on this piece for anything other than my own practice and education, well, in that case, I might decide to do some practice first. But given that this is really here for me to learn, I'm not going to sweat it. I think what makes more sense in a situation like this one would be to just go ahead and try and see what I learn rather than trying to set myself up for perfection, which in an instance like this where my focus is learning rather than having an original painting that's going to be entered into some competition, I would rather just go ahead and get in the rep, know that this might cause a problem, and just be ready for it and be prepared to adjust accordingly rather than kind of send myself spiraling or procrastinate to the point where I won't actually get any practice out of this. So the final thing that I mentioned wanting to touch on is the ear. So what I love about taking a look at Jamie's piece here is we can see the ears have been handled in a way that's pretty flat at this block-in stage. The only exception is really this one mark in the ear that's in the light that shows us that fold right at the top of the ear. And just like some of these other darker marks, we have a lot of evidence that this would have come much later. In the early stages, this ear was probably just pretty flatly this one color. And we see this essentially confirmed by the way that this ear in the shadow was handled. And when we look at the ear in the shadow of the Sargent piece, we see the same thing. This is just simply one flat color. But in the Sargent piece, the ear that's in the light has been taken to, I would say, more of a finish. There's just a little bit more information. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that the face is a little bit more angled. Some of it is to do with the fact that Sargent's piece is the final version, not the block-in like Jamie's. I'm not here to say which one is better than the other. It is simply that when I'm working on the master copy of this, it might make sense to treat it the way that Jamie did in his block-in, where I go ahead and establish this as essentially a flat color, and I hold back on these darker marks until a later stage. So for instance, this reddish mark, I can tell came a little bit later, and again, that has to do with the fact that I see it disrupting other shapes that seems to exist in a more harmonious gradient, a softer gradient underneath of that mark. Same thing with this dark mark at the top of the ear where that fold is. There's a little bit more of like a red mark here. Now, one key difference is that we have more of these lighter marks in here describing the anatomy of the ear as well. My suspicion is that the ear probably started with this base color. There is kind of this dark line that's permeating and seeming to like work its way into the hair. It looks like this might have actually been underneath of the rest of the ear color just based on this one edge. That's going to be something for me to think about. And then these darker accents probably came in as the last piece. So again, when it comes to as much of this portrait as possible, I really want to think about how I can handle this in a way that uses very flat color, that compresses the values towards the average value of the lights, not the highlights, not the dark accents, that prioritizes softer edges in the earlier stages and allows those edges to increasingly become very distinct and very decisive, like these jigsaw pieces. The darker and darker some of those shapes go. Or in the case of highlights, which we don't really see a lot of in these pieces, we could apply the same thinking there, where the very lightest shapes are afforded some harder edges. But I would say in the case of both of these, we're probably thinking of these more as something we're reserving for the darks. So with that, one final remark I want to make is I've actually spent a good amount of time already looking at this. So not only have you seen me prep for this in this particular video, but I did spend some time analyzing this and thinking about the things that I would share in this video before I even started. So I have probably spent an hour just looking at the piece and studying it. And imagine that I had my canvas set up on my easel and I was ready to start the block in. And I would ask myself, what does that actually need to look like step by step? I'm essentially doing what is referred to in some circles as playing the tape. This is something that, I can't remember the book that I learned this from, but the example that was given was of Michael Phelps when he was in training, where every night his coach would ask him to play the tape, which essentially meant that before bed, he wasn't going to actually play a physical tape. He was going to fully envision the perfect race, and he was going to play it through and imagine it in his mind's eye moment by moment. And I'm essentially adopting that and doing my version of that before I even dive in. And what it's allowing me to do is to walk you all through some of this decision making, but it's also allowing me to do some really vital prep work as I jump into this piece. One thing that really stands out to me because I took this extra time is that I don't want to just dive in and wing it. I am asking myself to actively evolve my process, to get better, to get better in the specific direction that I want to go. And that means that I have to disrupt my own patterns and habits and processes. I can't just do this by the seat of my pants and trust my intuition. I have to have a more clear, intentioned game plan than that. So, one thing that I know is that I don't want to release myself from the block-in stage until I have a pass on this piece that looks more like Jamie's portrait. And so when I dive into this piece here in just a minute, for me anyway, I'm going to be thinking about all these things. I'm going to be thinking about what order should the marks go down in? How do I not kind of jump around and just go off of instinct? What do the various stages of this work in progress need to look like so that I don't succumb to the temptation to dive into details or dive into the really dark or light accents really early in the piece? One final thing before I dive in, I'm actually going to make sure I have both of these up in front of me to help me in that quest. So, of course, I'm going to have the Sargent piece out since that's what I'm completing this master study of, but I'm also going to have Jamie's piece right here next to it. So I can make sure that I'm not just thinking about going from 0 to 100% based on Sargent's painting. I'm making sure that I'm actually stopping at what I want the block-in to look like based on Jamie's painting. Well, with that being said, I guess there's nothing left to do but to do it. So I'll see you in the next one.
If this breakdown helped you to see Sargent's work through a new lens, I hope it gives you a whole new level of clarity for your own paintings. And if you're ready to go deeper beyond master copies and into developing a personal expressive style that you're proud of, I'd love to have you join me in my upcoming live masterclass. I'll be sharing the full strategy that took me from stuck and striving to creating work that I'm genuinely proud of, and I'll walk you through how to apply that exact strategy to your own goals. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. Until then, happy painting.